Hello and welcome. We come this time to the beginning of what we know as Holy Week, one of the most wonderful but important times in our Christian year. Through the course of this week, this coming Sunday, of course, known as Palm Sunday or the Sunday of the Passion, it actually takes on a dual sense. The first part of our celebration will center around Jesus' entrance into the city of Jerusalem, which we know as Palm Sunday. And then the gospel will pick up the gospel tradition, this time of Matthew. As you remember, on the Sunday of Palm Sunday, for the 3 years, we hear either the Passion from Matthew, Mark, or Luke. This year being called the A year, we listen to the Passion account as remembered in Matthew. Now the readings which are assigned for our celebration this time, first comes again from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 50, verses 4 through 7. From the letter of Paul to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. And then from the Gospel of Matthew, so we will have two readings. The first, the one assigned to Palm Sunday, that is the Palm ceremony, is from chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. And then the Passion narrative is chapter 26, verse 14 through chapter 27, verse 66. So all of that's a little bit of a background to the readings. Now, just a word of introduction, and remember what we are looking at in these discussions, presentations, is really what the scriptural tradition says, the way in which we interpret it, the way in which we reflect on it during Holy Week, of course, is adapted and adopted to our Christian thought, to our Catholic thinking through the years. Now, if you think about it, when we let us first of all just say a few comments about the first reading, the one attributed to Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem. Now, it is important to remember that the tradition of Matthew heavily relies on the tradition of Mark. And his kind of framework, much of the information that he gives, both for the entrance into Jerusalem and for the Passion narrative, Matthew uses Mark as his framework. In some cases, he simply says similar things or the same things as Mark, but in some cases, he tweaks it a bit to bring his own kind of emphasis into play. So, when Jesus enters, and of course this is pretty consistent, the city of Jerusalem, he has been making this journey, you remember, coming up to Jerusalem. Whether or not, and of course, according to the setting of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the time that Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem is Passover time. Now, this time is pretty much shared by all four of the evangelists. And there would have been a larger number of people in the city of Jerusalem at this time. But whether or not, as the gospel writers see it, the whole of Jerusalem gathered when Jesus entered into Jerusalem might be a little bit more an exaggeration. But certainly some of the followers of Jesus, some of the friends of Jesus, hearing that he was coming to Jerusalem, would have been there to greet him. And he rides into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. Now, to be honest with you, most pilgrimages, that is pilgrims, would have entered the city by walking. Only certain persons would ride animals. Conquering heroes often rode horses into the city of Jerusalem. So Jesus rides in, as we all know this, on a donkey, which was generally a work animal, very important in many parts of Israel for their contribution to agriculture. And but also Symbolism, and this of course is important for Matthew, who often looks for, as you remember, Old Testament writings or thoughts to help develop his framework in telling the narration about Jesus. And so here he uses a sentence from the prophet Zechariah, who says this: "Tell the daughter of Zion, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So it's that passage that Matthew here uses as Jesus enters the city. Now, there's a little bit of a contradiction here, because if you take it literally, Jesus is riding two animals at once, namely the donkey and then the foal, who is the kind of offspring. But probably that wasn't what's important here to notice, but rather the literalness of it. That in Hebrew thinking, particularly in the Psalms, but often in the prophets, an idea is given and then reiterated in the same way, but with slightly different imagery. The idea that this would kind of help a person remember. So Jesus enters on a donkey, or let's say Jesus enters on a foal, which is the offspring of a donkey. Get that it reiterates what? That the picture of the donkey is often recognized both as a pretty ordinary animal and represents humility. And that, of course, is what we believe that is emphasized here. So Jesus enters coming from Bethsabes, which is a place not too far from Bethany. You remember last time we discussed Bethany and the importance of that place. So when Jesus enters here, and the Bethsabes, which means the house of figs, was really a small village, perhaps just slightly across the road, we think, from Bethany. When Jesus is ready to enter the city, he sends a message ahead by one of his disciples, who goes to a person who says, "The master has need." Now, of an animal, and that's how they bring it to Jesus. Question is, did Jesus have already made an arrangement in the city of Jerusalem for this to happen? Or was it really on the spot, simultaneous? We really don't know, but you do have to kind of wonder why a man would have immediately given use of an animal to someone whom he didn't know, or simply had heard his reputation about him. One of the characteristics that makes this account by Matthew different is that a term that he uses twice now in these stories, that the whole city shook. Now, some would say that there was a slight tremor of the earth. Earthquakes were known and are known to occur in this part of the world, but whether that was the case or whether it shook because of the number of people that gathered to welcome Jesus. However it is, Jesus enters the city, is greeted. People cut branches down from the tree and throw their cloaks in front of him. The only term not used, we've mentioned this on one of our earlier talks, is that they were palms. Although we call this Palm Sunday, we're not sure what the branches of trees were. And cloaks, of course, would have been a sign of reverence, a sign of greeting to Jesus. So that's the introduction text. It's a little bit longer, and in many ways simply follows the pattern set out by Luke. Now we come to the gospel narrative, which is the Passion narrative. Let me begin by just a little bit of a reminder that in this story, in this account, Jesus is, certainly by standards of the time, humiliated. It's a story of Jesus who dies a shameful death. And in the Mediterranean world in which Jesus had grown up, What this story will do, and it's important to notice this, is that God will turn a shameful death into a completely different experience, turning the world, as it were, upside down through the power and gift of the resurrection. So although the Passion narrative is prologue, and very important to notice here, it is always leading to the story and the remembrance of the resurrection when Jesus is raised from the dead. In that way, God honors Jesus more than anyone else could have, and he obliterates by that action Jesus' shame. Now, Jesus certainly, in the course of the gospel narration that we're going to listen to, seemingly receives shameful actions. He's betrayed, there are false witnesses, there's a kangaroo court, there is bullying. But interestingly, as the story unfolds, Jesus is master of his fate throughout the story. He trusts that God will vindicate him, absolutely confident that God will act and set things right. So Jesus is presented here, and this would be important to many in Jesus' time, as an extraordinary hero. He takes the best punishment his enemies can give and throws them back without flinching, without crying, without fainting. Jesus endures flogging, verbal insult, crowning with thorns, crucifixion itself, and does not shriek, does not cry out. Matthew's only sentence that he gives to Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" which we know is a prayerful response to the taunts of those around him who claim that God has abandoned him. In fact, these are the opening words to Psalm 22, which is a prayer filled with the agony of a believer who remains ever trustful and loyal to God. So all of that is perhaps important to notice, that by the time that the gospel writer Matthew presents his story, remember, well after the fall of Jerusalem, and at the time in which a group known as the Pharisees are gaining popularity. And I reiterate this because it's important, particularly in Matthew's story, somewhat in John's, not certainly the case in the other two, that there is this real tension, you remember, between the Judaism which is being reformed in the 80s of the common time by the Pharisees and by those who accept Jesus as the Messiah, who are also of the Hebraic tradition. And this tension is brought out throughout the gospel, but now it will be brought out in a very strong way in the Passion narrative. And that's why I wanted to kind of make this point as we begin. The Pharisees and the scribes are the opponents. I was going to say the bad guys, but it's more important to see they are the opponents of the community represented by Matthew. So the account that we're going to listen to, and we can only kind of summarize some of this with the opportunities that we have here in our discussion here, begins with the knowledge that Judas Iscariot is planning to hand Jesus over to the opponents, okay? Now, even the word Iscariot, which tells us means the man of Cariot, or some say that it comes from the word Sicarius in the Greek or the Roman, which means dagger men. Now, whether or not Judas was part of that movement, we don't know. There was this so-called zealot movement. The motive for why Judas does what he does seems to be greed. You remember that when he goes to the leaders, they offer to give him, or he asks for, 30 silver pieces, which, by the way, was the value of a slave gored by an ox. Now again, the book of Zechariah gives this information by saying that it was the wage of a shepherd. Point is, it's not a whole lot, but there is scriptural reference for the amount that is given. Jesus now is pictured as gathering his disciples together for a meal. Here once again, to pause a little bit, just so that we have kind of background as we look at this. This is called by Mark and then picked up by Matthew and Luke as a Passover meal, and that the event of what we call the Last Supper took place at the Passover time. However, in looking at things, particularly from a historical point of view, there has been raised a number of problems with regard to this being the actual setting of the meal. Those who look at the fourth gospel, the Johannine tradition, suggest that the time frame that John gives might be a little more accurate than the one which the synoptics give. What do I mean? That if it's true that this is a Passover meal, then Jesus will celebrate this with the disciples. And notice this is the way in which we carry out our liturgy during Holy Week. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, is there a little bit, is arrested there, is taken to the house of Caiaphas, which is scourged, etc., is then brought to the Pontius Pilate early in the morning, is judged to be worthy of crucifixion, takes the road to Calvary, is nailed to the cross around noon, and dies at 3 p.m. Now, the only problem is that's a lot of action to happen within a relatively short period of time. The time frame or chronology that's given by the fourth gospel suggests that the Last Supper took place on a Tuesday, that at that meal, because it's a prologue to the Passover, in the fourth gospel, Jesus dies on the day before the Passover, the great Jewish feast. Now, how does it frame that? Well, if he has the Last Supper on Tuesday, is arrested, so you have Wednesday, Thursday, you have a workable time frame in which this movement of Jesus to the different places that he is taken, finally to his being sentenced to death by Pilate, and dying on the afternoon in which at the very moment, according to the Johannine tradition, the lambs are being slaughtered in the temple area by the high priest that will be used at the Passover meal, is the very time in which Jesus, who is the true Lamb of God, is executed or dies. So there are two theories, therefore, about the time frame. Just again, as a background, as we look at the kind of scriptural tradition which is here. In Matthew now, at the supper, Jesus is always pictured, even in Matthew, as knowing sort of what's going to happen. In other words, the things that happen to Jesus are not a total surprise. Now, does he know this because he is divine and therefore God has given him this insight? Well, that's one of the ways of interpreting it. But from another point of view, Jesus is a pretty sharp guy. He's not unaware that the forces who are opposed to him are beginning to gather strength, particularly when he here is in Jerusalem, and there are those who know that he's there and beginning to kind of gather around him. So he does things a bit quietly. He doesn't, announce where he's going to be for this supper. So purposely, why? Because perhaps he knows what they might be planning to do. He hopes that they don't, but nevertheless, that's a real possibility. At the supper, Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." That we know is Judas. They ask who. He says, "The one with whom I dip my hand in the dish. That was a common way of eating. You remember, we might not like all the sanitary aspects of this in our time, but it was the way in which this particular meal was celebrated. So to dip into the bowl, to take something of what the puree that was there with the person who was going to betray him happened at the same time, that would make some sense. In the words that are given, this is my body, this is my blood, they're pretty consistent with the other two synoptic traditions, with one addition that Matthew makes, that when he says, this is the blood of the covenant, which is offered up for the forgiveness of sins. This is a distinctive contribution to the Last Supper words that are given by Matthew. And notice that in our liturgy, we kind of always said these are the exact words. Well, looking at the three traditions of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, one notices that there are variations in the wording. So it perhaps is not the exactitude of the words, but the intent that we have always kept, and which is always very important to remember. After the supper, they leave. They make a journey now to the place of Gethsemane. They sing a series of psalms, which are known as the Hallel songs. And of course, in the course of this, the question with regard to Peter comes up. Jesus kind of says to them, one of you will betray me. Once again, Peter makes his acclamation of support. Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. So it's important to notice that there will be a contrast between Judas and Peter. Both of them, in their own way, betrayed Jesus in a moment of need, but one of them never seeks or gets forgiveness, and the other does, and that, of course, would be Peter. Now, what happens next is that Matthew records the fact that when they get to the garden, it is the famous prayer, Jesus suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane. That pretty much has the same variations as the other two. 3 times Jesus goes and comes, and you have the same famous trio, Peter, James, and John, in that. Now, when Jesus is arrested, the arresters come. Judas is leading them. Now, keep in mind that the Garden of Gethsemane at night is going to be kind of dark. There may well have been the Passover moon, which is a full moon, and therefore would have shown light, but that's all. So they would have carried torches and other kind of things in order to see. But did the arresting group know who Jesus was? Did they not need, and there's why Judas would be present, someone to point him out? He goes up to Jesus and says, Rabbi. Now, this is one of the only, or few times, really the only second time in the whole of this gospel that the term rabbi is used, and here it is used by Jesus in really a terrible way. It's the signature by which he is pointing out Jesus. Jesus kind of says to him, do you betray me? Well, yes. And Jesus is arrested. Now, keep in mind that he is arrested as if he were a brigand, as if he were an imposter or a magician. And therefore, the reason for his arrest is a political reason, not a religious reason. Now, what begins, and this would be in verses 57 through 75 of chapter 6, so again, moving along, we have what is called the sandwich effect. This was developed by Mark, and Matthew uses it. Namely, you have a double trial. You have the trial of Jesus going on, usually in an upper level, and the trial of Peter going on at the lower level. And what you have is the beginning of the trial of Jesus. You then have the trial of Peter in the middle, like in a sandwich, and then the conclusion at the end. In this gospel, and I'm sorry that we're really not going to be able to get too much further into this, you have the story of Judas going back to the leaders, throwing the coins on the temple floor, sorry for what he has done, and goes out and hangs himself. So this is the synoptic version, although in the Acts there's a little different reason for the death of Judas. Now, there are a number of variations that occur throughout the gospel, but let me come to one that I really want to look at. When Jesus is, and Pilate in this case, attempts, interestingly, to save Jesus. So in this account, two different things are introduced into the Passion narrative. One, Pilate's wife sends word to him to have nothing to do with Jesus because he's innocent. And two, as he's getting ready to condemn Jesus to death, Pilate washes his hands. Now those are two things that we find only in the Matthean tradition. But one of the things that then is said by the leaders, and again the leaders here are the Pharisees and the scribes, who get the crowd to cry out that they want Jesus, have this saying, or this saying is recorded, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." Now we need to be very careful because this line was terribly used by Christians in the next 2,000 years. As if it were, this group were therefore approving whatever happened to them was the result of what happened to Jesus. His blood be upon us. So it took on a very negative view and really was one of the bases for the development of anti-Semitism, of the movement against the Jews that went on throughout much of the Middle Ages, of the terrible fear that Christians were taught to have about the Jews, and of course that the Christian of Judaism had. His blood be upon us and upon our children was adapted or adopted to mean all the Israelites said this. Now, even if this saying were true, and we're not sure that really it was, it would simply be that group, not all of Judaism, as unfortunately it would be applied. So I point this out. One other characteristic is that Matthew points out that there was darkness that came upon the earth when Jesus was crucified, and that this was followed upon Jesus' death, that there was an earthquake, and the saints of the city arose and were heard throughout the city. Again, important perhaps to notice that Matthew likes this kind of rumbling of the earth. And finally, moving as quickly as we can, after Jesus' death, and there are a number of things we have to leave out here, when the death of Jesus is reported to Pilate, the leaders, that is, again, the scribes and the Pharisees, ask that a guard be placed there because they say, well, his disciples will come and steal his body, and they'll say that he is risen from the dead. So in this account, after the death of Jesus, the soldiers are placed in front of the tomb where Jesus has been laid, in a new tomb, freshly carved out of the rock, and now, whoever this guard is, we're not sure whether there were soldiers of Pilate who had set there, or that they were some guards that the Pharisees got to put there. But that's a kind of unique distinction at the very end of the Passion narrative that we're going to hear. We also found that there's a consistency present when this happens, namely that you have Mary Magdalene, who is mentioned consistently at both being at the foot of the cross and as noticing where Jesus was buried and what had happened. The two witnesses are Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And we're not sure who the other Mary is. Interesting also, at the foot of the cross, according to Matthew, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was also one of those there. It's not highlighted a lot in our discussion, but nevertheless, Matthew makes that important. There are a number of other points. I wish we had a little bit more opportunity to go into those, but those are at least are a couple of distinctive characteristics that Matthew adds to the basically Markan framework for the Passion of Jesus. On Good Friday, we hear the story as remembered by John, a very different chronology, and hopefully we might sometime be able to look at that. Once again, thank you very much for being with us. Have a very prosperous and holy week. Thank you.